This videotape presents Dr. Bayard Carter, first professor and chairman of the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology at Duke University Medical Center. Dr. Carter was born in Wilmington, Delaware. After completing his undergraduate studies at the University of Delaware in 1920, Dr. Carter was in residence at Oxford University in England as a Rhodes Scholar. He studied medicine at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, receiving his MD degree in 1925. Dr. Carter spent his intern and resident years at the Yale University School of Medicine, New Haven Hospital. After a 2-year period on the faculty of the University of Virginia, Dr. Carter joined the faculty of Duke University in 1931.
Dr. Carter, a lot of people have called you Nick. That's your nickname, I believe.
That's correct.
Where did it come from?
Well, when I was a young boy, the Nick Carter detective stories were prohibited reading in most families, but all the boys read them. So anybody named Carter was called Nick, from the so-called detective.
Well, now, you came to Duke from Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
What were the circumstances that led you to Durham, North Carolina, and to Duke Medical Center?
Well, I wanted to stay in the eastern part, and I wanted to work in the South because I thought the South was an attractive part of the country, and also because the schools, were coming up. You see what I mean? Building up, and they needed building. And Duke was a young school, had a dean with some good ideas of medical education, and I inquired around about the different faculty, and when I found out who they were, then I would naturally be interested in coming to Duke. So in short, it was simply the fact that you can start in your own without any records in the medical library, and you can see what you can do with a situation, not only in education, but in training and also in community care and responsibility, because I do think we have a great responsibility there. And not alone in medicine, but also in paramedical training of people. This paramedical training is going to be one of the great things, I feel, if we are to continue to run things properly in any hospital, because the so-called skills that you need are so diversified that it's ridiculous to think that any one person can be knowledgeable enough to direct all types of laboratories, all types of clinical investigation, basic science, applied science. You just can't do it. So that in picking your staff, you try to pick people who know a lot more about certain things than you do.
Well, then I trust that when you first began this operation in 1931, then you got a chance to pick your own staff.
You had a chance to pick your own staff. You had a chance to pick your own house staff, who are, of course, some of whom are going to be your future teachers. We estimated that probably 30% of the staff we took might be oriented towards the teaching of medicine. We almost made that a fact. So you had in the medical education at that time, of course, you had some very good schools, and you had some very poor schools. And we thought that Duke would be able, with the type of man that they had in other departments and so forth in the administration side of the university, it was a good opportunity to see what could be done in a private institution, because this is still a private.
Well, apparently you were quite impressed with Duke in those years when you were first coming here.
We all had high hopes, of course, of a lot of things which we never got, but that in one way made it a lot more interesting, because nobody can ever have everything that he or she wants in living, and the same thing's true around an institution. But I think the whole experience was worthwhile.
What would you say were your chief ambitions in those early years of beginning the department?
I think a chief ambition is to be able properly to teach this stuff. When I use that word teach, I use it advisedly, because I don't think you teach many people.
What do you do then?
I think you give them an opportunity, and I think the smart ones will do it. Any teaching you do, I think, has to do with convincing the student, undergraduate, graduate, postgraduate, and even the faculty, of our own faculty and our own selves, that education goes on every day as long as you live. The person who can't think and reason and want to learn, he turns out not to be a very successful teacher, clinician, researcher, or whatnot. In other words, it's continuing education from start to finish. And you hope that you can do in the training, that you can at least teach or preach this idea that you've got to keep on your mental, what you call side, the idea that you've got to learn something every day to keep abreast of all the changes. And even in those days there were changes. They talk about the medical explosion nowadays in knowledge. There were plenty of unexplored alleys in those days. Some people get lost in them, others go down the dead end and come out in good shape.
Would you care to mention one or two of those alleys that were hard to explore?
Well, for instance, maternal care has always been way down on the list of anything. In other words, all this preachment that parturition and pregnancy is a normal physiologic process is far from the truth. In short, I think today, looking back, that eventually they'll realize with all these problems, there's so many people to care for, so many this and that, so much non-education and so forth, that you're going to find pregnancy will eventually be considered probably the worst disease of any civilization. And I mean that in a purely broad sense, not how many women die in a state. At that time, North Carolina was 46th in maternal mortality, way down the line in infant mortality. And these were conditions over which very few medical personnel or public health personnel had any control. So that you had education to do not only in your own center, medical center, but also throughout the various portions of the state and the country. And North Carolina was not alone in this. The cancer problem, for instance, was another problem we were naturally interested in. And this, of course, takes great resources of mental power and men, but more than that, it takes an intelligent citizenry, because it's very hard to sell, for instance, to ignorant people what is necessary in relation to health services. I don't mean just in relation to women's care, but to everybody's care. Syphilis was a great problem in those days. 30% of many of our ward patients had syphilis. This has practically been eradicated, so that now we see very little syphilis. When we see it, it's a unique thing, and you can use it to demonstrate to students who have never seen active syphilis before. But all of these factors, there's so many facets of any care for patients that it's ridiculous to try to focus on your own. I think another thing that makes everybody interested in this so-called academic medicine is the ability to have, as your next door, say, neighbor in another department, people who know a great deal about this field and that field. And in those days, of course, some of these so-called medical educators were against specialization. They were interested in creating what you call a general, we call a generalist now, and which will in time be called a primary physician, as it's stated. But we had to also make sure that we got from the people who came through us certain group interested in teaching, other group interested in going into a community and being able to handle all these problems with surety and with confidence, and who could also, therefore, as the pebble goes in the pool, this first wave swings out, and from that go on other and other waves. We had no society in North Carolina for obstetrics and gynecology. We had no place in that we could go. The nearest place we could go for meeting would be to motor to Richmond, or we could motor down to Atlanta, or we might even say, if we had the money, go to New Orleans. You were always welcome. But we had to group the people together to get them interested in these common problems, and out of this came the formation of the North Carolina Obstetric and Gynecologic Society, the South Atlantic, and also eventually, by this type of thing spreading all through the states, we had the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. And it's just exactly similar to a wave starting. We don't mean we threw the pebble. We may have been a part of the wave. It was
I expect you were quite instrumental in getting a number of these organizations started here.
We certainly gave it all the support we could give it.
What other types of contributions would you say that you have made to medical science since you've been chairman of the department here?
I would say I made very few contributions.
And we all know that is not so.
No, this is true. I don't think that you'll find that. Only thing is, you can't lose sight of the fundamentals of what killed people. Any contributions we made were directed towards finding out why these patients died, and by investigation trying to see if we could prevent it. The growth, of course, of cancer therapy, naturally we would get a lot of cancer here. We did. We had more cancer than we needed to present that subject to the students, but we had to take care of it and wanted to take care of it. And I think that the radiologist and now the radiotherapists contribute just as much to this picture as we do as individuals. So I think it's all a matter of teamwork. I don't think anybody, if he looks, or she, if he or she looks at contributions, would say that he or she would want to tear up many of them. But certainly he's not going to think that he's a scientist and this and that. You have to have, in clinical medicine, you've got to have some clinical ability. This is the first thing we stressed. A man who wants to be a doctor, primarily, if he wants to be a clinical doctor, has to be able to take the responsibility for the care of patients. And this is a sine qua non. But this doesn't mean that you don't have in your department, or try to have, people of other disciplines, PhDs, doctors of science, or even engineers, physicists. We need all this group properly to do any of this. Same way with when we came, there was opposition to even starting an endocrine clinic, which we started, and we had to finance it all ourselves. We got no help from anybody. We had to do the same thing with a bacteriologic lab. These people used to die of infections. And through the kindness and cooperation of the bacteriologic department, they trained a man for us who probably saved more women's lives than any of us put together by accurate bacteriology. And this is another pebble. You throw it, bang, it goes into some other fields.
I believe you have also made a number of written articles, or presented a number of written articles to publications. You've also, well, started out as a Rhodes Scholar there.
Well, that's all right. That's way in the past. It was a good experience because I had an opportunity to work with some wonderful men, not only gentlemen, but also very good physiologists. And I think it always does you good to see that the real scientist is still inquisitive, but he's still what you call modest. And very few of them will tell you in private talk that their contribution is too great, but they work at it, and they get new facets going. And this, I think, is a good thing. But I'm glad I did the physiology. It was rigorous, it was hard, but it's a good preparation. And, of course, in those days, it was, if you take any of the things that you could work upon, the problem there was no research money really in those days from federal grants or this and that. There were other things that had to go first, and it's perfectly natural that certain departments would get more than we would get, but you always feel that your own specialty has a place in patient care and also in contributing some of these scientific things. So I think the best thing we did was to found, as I say, the laboratories to back up and prove our clinical experience. You can't prove your clinical experience unless you have a good scientific background on what your laboratory tells you. This is true in a clinical workup or any type of thing. You've got to have added help. You've got to have the chemistry laboratory, you've got to have the bacteriology laboratory, the endocrine laboratory, and the pathology, all working to prove, substantiate, and improve medical care. So the one thing I liked about it was certainly a cooperative. Some of us had so little money we couldn't do as much as we'd like to do, but anything that you could get done was done, but it was done on a cooperative basis.
And tremendous strides were made right here under your care.
Well, I mean, not under my care. All I did was worry about budget and space and all this and that. That's not much fun. And as I say, it was slow in coming, but I think it was worthwhile. But I think that the men who we put through, as we call it, put them through the mill, the majority did turn out to be quite good physicians, those that elected to be physicians, and we thought that the ones that elected to teach were good teachers. Now, what you teach is another matter. I go back to that original statement. You don't teach anybody much. In other words, I think the teacher learns, pardon me, more from the student and his house staff than he teaches them. Because they're the ones that question and bring up the problems, why, when, where, whither, and how. And this is darn important.
Dr. Carter, you are a modest man.
I am not modest.
I would like for you to give me a statement of which of the many honors that have come your way you consider the highest honor.
Well, the fact that my wife didn't divorce me in those old days, I think she should have the accolade. But I'd like to pay tribute to the men who work for us for nothing practically, actually nothing. In other words, it was a problem simply of, do you have a laboratory and pay your technicians, or do you pay yourself? This you'll never forget. Any man that's willing to do that, to me, he's a memento, that's all. He's a real monument. And that's what I think that I enjoyed most. I never had a staff that, if they thought it was better to put the money in something for the hospital, they didn't put it there. And these are true statements. Because, well, if you look at the salary list of your technicians and people in the old days, were ridiculous. But the buying power of a 1,500, 1,800 was comparable now to, what, 3,000, 3,500.
Do we have people like that today?
Oh, sure.
What do you see in the future for the Duke Medical Center and for the department that you founded?
Well, I would like to be optimistic about it, but I have a direct fear in my own thinking, having had the experience of seeing what happened in England and Australia and New Zealand. I hope that private schools will continue to exist, but I have my grave doubts if they will, if this political trend, which is everywhere, keeps on going. I think the trend will be to have more and more governmental control over education in every way. And this, I think, is something you have to think about.
Will this be even in patient care and in teaching?
Oh, surely. This is already here. It's here in many, many fields of endeavor. And, for instance, if you look at the funding of many of our ward patients here, this is federal money given to states after the state has put it into federal. But we hope that this type of expenditure will certainly redound to the benefit of patients, that the care will improve. And I'm not making any criticism of it. I mean, after all, this country was founded as a republic, and it still is, and the majority has the say. And I think the majority of people are going the wrong way. That is, relying more and more on centralization instead of getting in their own area and doing something about it there. I am not a centralist, in other words, in medicine or anything else. I don't think anybody can grasp all the problems of medicine. I don't care who he is. And I don't think the politician can either. See?
Because of all this, you still do not see the Duke Medical Center, though, falling by the wayside.
I think you got enough people around here interested in it that'll try their darndest to keep it going. And I think it will go. But certainly if it were to fold up tomorrow, it's done a magnificent job in my opinion. And that's not, I'm not me myself, I'm just talking about the center as such. And I think it's, well, I mean, when you get near the end of the line, you just like to tell people this. Not about your own department, but about a center as a conjoined structure. And it was a darn good structure. And it did good medicine, good teaching, some darn good research. So I don't see how anybody could regret ever giving any time to Duke Center. We were fortunate in a lot of ways. We were never told how to vote. We were never electioneered by anybody. As long as you didn't run too high on your debts, why, they didn't bother you. This is appreciated, you see. There are many, many fringe benefits that haven't got to do with insurance and this and that. That is the attitude of the whole university towards each other and towards the teacher, because I enjoyed that. In other words, it used to be quite hard to even stir up a political argument, you see.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carter.
Not at all.
Sir.
Well, that was painful.